Hello, everyone, and welcome to a wonderful program today on the electric co-ops and microgrid, which is presented with the support and friendship and partnership of USAID and Kristen Madler, and the wonderful speakers that we have today, John Lemire and Jared Leader, who will address the wonderful developments with respect to microgrids in the electric co-op space. I'm Sheila Hollis. I'm the Acting Executive Director of the United States Energy Association, which has the honor and the pleasure of working closely with USAID, DOE, and the State Department on a variety of projects, both domestically and internationally. We worked hand in hand with them since about 30 years ago, actually, and it's been a tremendous privilege and honor to play a part in that for both USEA and the individuals involved in USEA. A moment about what is USEA. It's a nonprofit, non-lobbying, nonpartisan organization. We've worked in 104 countries around the world, and we also do programs domestically to convene and inform and have representation from all aspects of the energy industry and those impacted by it. It is a tremendous honor to be playing a small role as an acting executive director. And we look forward to working with the USAID to work better to better the world, the availability of energy in the world, the safety of energy in the world, the environmental acceptability of energy in the world and domestically as well. And thus it is my pleasure and honor to turn it over to the panel, introduce you to Kristen, Jake, John, and Jared. And thank you so much for joining us all today. And I know you're going to learn a lot.
Thank you, Sheila. Well, welcome everyone. My name is Kristen Madler. I work in USAID's Global Energy and Infrastructure Office, and I manage USAID's Energy Utility Partnership Program. I wanted to thank USDA for organizing this event and for their continued commitment to collaborating with USAID. USAID and USDA have worked together for more than 25 years to utilize public and private sector expertise as a critical resource to modernize power sectors. And we consistently hear from our partner utilities that this peer-to-peer engagement is very highly valued. So today's presentation is part of our Grid Modernization webinar series. And grid modernization efforts help integrate all sources of electricity, solve energy storage and distribution generation challenges, strengthen grid security, and provide a critical platform for innovation to deliver resilient, reliable, flexible, secure, sustainable, and affordable electricity. And right now, utilities and energy companies have an unprecedented opportunity to invest in technologies and solutions that enhance the visibility and control that operators have across the electric system. And these technologies enable a range of new capabilities that improve resiliency, reduce operational costs, and increase efficiency to effectively enhance the quality of electric service. And so today I'm excited to hear from our speakers as they'll discuss how utilities can prepare for increasing climate risks and natural disasters. For utilities, it's important to understand the likely impacts from increasing extreme weather events to help plan and to protect energy infrastructure, to ensure critical systems are able to function, and to also support communities during and after an event. And so today you'll hear from pilots to programs about strategies for assessing climate change vulnerability, planning, and investment steps to consider to better protect your assets and operations before extreme weather events occur. So I would like to thank today's electric power industry leaders, Jared Leader and John Lemire, for joining us today. We greatly appreciate your time and commitment. Thank you so much. And I'll pass it over to Jake to continue.
Great. Thank you so much, Kristen. And thank you everyone for joining our fourth webinar in our Grid Modernization series. My name is Jake Swanson, and I'm a program coordinator at the U.S. Energy Association, working on the Energy Utility Partnership Program that's based in Washington, D.C. Please note that this webinar is being recorded, and all participants are muted with their video turned off. But you're definitely welcome and encouraged to post questions in the Q&A box below, and I'll be passing them on to our presenters as appropriate at the end. You can find recordings of past webinars at usda.org/EUPP/webinars, and they're broken down by the different series. So this is our Grid Modernization series, and we also have our cybersecurity series, both of which were under the Business Innovation Partnership that I work with Kristen on. So today's webinar will cover microgrid planning, and we're very lucky to have two great speakers today with a lot of expertise in the subject. First, we have Jared Leader, who is the Senior Manager of Research and Industry Strategy at the Smart Electric Power Alliance. Jared joined SEPA in 2017, and in his role, he develops strategic plans for programs, products, and service offerings for utility and industry stakeholder members and clients that facilitate the integration of DERs and microgrids onto the modern grid. Jared leads SEPA's Microgrids Working Group and co-led DC Public Service Commission's Grid Modernization Working Groups. He has his Master's of Science in Energy Policy and Climate from Johns Hopkins, and a BS in Civil and Environmental Engineering from the University of Virginia. We're also pleased to have John Lemire, who's the Director of Grid Management at North Carolina Electric Membership Cooperation, the power supply organization that serves North Carolina's electric co-ops. And John is responsible for implementing the North Carolina co-ops distribution operator framework. And John is also responsible for the integration and implementation of grid technology programs, including energy efficiency, energy storage, solar, and microgrids. And John actually served as a project manager for the Butler Farms microgrid prior to NCEMC. He's been with NCEMC since 2012 and has more than 17 years of electric utility experience. He has his BS in electrical engineering from NC State and an MBA from Liberty University. So with that, I'll pass the floor over to Jared to start his presentation, and then we'll go to John, and then we'll do a little Q&A at the end.
Awesome. Great. Thank you, Jake. And thank you to USEA and USAID for the opportunity to speak. I'm excited about this panel, particularly John and I have worked together in the past. And while John will bring a lot of the cooperative experience and direct project management experience with some of the microgrid projects that he has worked on in North Carolina, I'm going to be providing an overview of not only what utilities can do, but all stakeholders can do together collectively for comprehensive resiliency planning and identifying microgrid projects and other local generation projects in areas of need and vulnerable populations. So I'm really excited today to discuss with you all the approaches that we're taking at SEPA, not only with cooperative utilities, but all utilities in the country experiencing power outages and resiliency needs. Real quick about SEPA. SEPA is Smart Electric Power Alliance. We're a nonprofit organization that envisions a carbon-free energy system by 2050. So what does that mean? Really, we are one of many entities globally required to make this vision a reality. Our role is to facilitate this journey towards a carbon-free, working with our members and our clients who make up a lot of industry stakeholders, such as utilities and solution providers, regulatory agencies and government agencies and so forth, through our research, standards, and collaboration. So one of the things that we do, is educate, and I'm excited here today to walk you through some of the work that we've been up to over the past year or so, working on planning microgrids. And I hope that after this presentation that you all can take away a few insights of your own in terms of embarking on microgrid planning or identifying sites that could help you and where you are in your energy planning and design. The presentation today is going to be drawing from two specific papers that were published by SEPA. Actually, one that was published last spring called the Microgrid Playbook, Community Resilience for Natural Disasters. Another paper that is planned to be published next month. So a sneak peek at some of the work that we're doing on microgrid design. And this will lead into John's presentation on some of the specific projects in North Carolina. Before we get started, I'm going to be talking about microgrids a lot. So before we go into detail, I wanted to briefly touch on what is a microgrid. Microgrids mean a lot of things to a lot of different people. So it's simple to break down the definition with a few defining characteristics. The first defining characteristic is interconnected loads. As you can see on the diagram, you see a lot of different loads, critical loads, controllable loads. Those are interconnected loads within a defined electrical boundary, which is another characteristic of a microgrid that's designated by the circle, the dotted circle line around the conceptual microgrid here we see on the right hand of the slide. It also includes distributed energy resources, which includes controllable loads, critical loads, as well as local generation. So you see some limited and non-controllable generation that might be renewable energy resources. You see controllable generation and backup generation that may be more firm fossil fuel-based generation, and as well as energy storage. An example could be a battery energy storage system. But the main characteristic, the primary characteristic of a microgrid is the notion that it is a single controllable entity that can be grid connected or islanded, meaning if the main grid goes down, then it has the ability to switch off of the main grid and operate completely independently. And that is shown here by the point of common coupling where it is connected to the main grid and the ability to disconnect and connect as needed. And the main value driver of microgrids is resilience. The notion of resisting against a power outage, absorbing a threat and being able to ride through, to recover quickly from a man-made or natural disaster, and to adapt quickly in changing conditions. So when it comes to energy resilience, and when it comes to electricity resilience in particular, microgrids are one tool in the toolbox to increase resilience. So what does this mean for the different stakeholders in the industry? Typically, the energy industry is made up of the utilities, the community members, and the customers. Somewhere in between there are technology providers and solution providers. But microgrids can deliver resilience to all different stakeholders. And whether who you are and where you sit, that may change. For utilities and members of the community and government agencies, really the main driver is national security, supporting critical infrastructure such as emergency management agencies and public institutions that are made up of the community. And then when you look at the utility and the customer perspective, really talking about business continuity. So what comes to mind is a certain business that requires to stay online, and if there is a power outage, they may lose some economic development and economic loss. So the reliability of powers of utmost importance. And I've heard it described in the commercial and industrial sector as microgrids as an insurance policy to maintain their business. While the private sector is an important driver for microgrids, really the focus today is on the public good and looking at critical infrastructure, which kind of leads me to the right hand of the resiliency triangle here that we're looking at, centered around public health and safety and emergency preparedness. Services that provide a public good, such as hospitals, gas stations, grocery stores, banks, police stations, and fire departments. These types of facilities are of utmost importance to the community, and oftentimes when the grid goes down, they're the services that need power the most. So entering in use cases for microgrids, we've touched a little bit on that. I'm going to focus more on the left hand of the slide rather than the right. There are, of course, agricultural use cases for farm microgrids, like the Butler Farms microgrid in North Carolina that John was a project manager on, residential, industrial, commercial, military as well for national security. Many critical bases are looking at microgrid solutions as a way to even more of an insurance policy, right, for their critical function as a military base. But like I mentioned, the public safety, critical infrastructure such as wastewater and water treatment plants, healthcare facilities and hospitals and hospice are becoming increasingly more important to deliver reliable power as the natural disaster and different threats increase, and with probability and intensity. So the SEPA developed a 5-step approach for government agencies and utilities to start planning microgrids, ultimately to determine where microgrids would be best suited and have the highest potential. I'm going to go in there for a sec in a moment, but I wanted to touch on a few specific natural disaster threats and a few things that you can do to increase your resiliency through microgrid and building resiliency. Earthquakes, we've done a lot of research and work with stakeholders in the Pacific Northwest who are constantly in threat of earthquake and landslide susceptibility. And some of the things that we've seen folks do in this area of the country is developing on-site fuel storage that's rated for seismic events to withstand an earthquake. There's also the American Society of Civil Engineering has several seismic standards to build microgrid hardening and to strengthen against an earthquake, shock mount storage systems. And of course, if you're building in an area that potentially is susceptible to earthquake, geotechnical siting concerns, structural equipment, seismic hardening as well. Obviously, hurricane is a big threat all over the world. And we've seen time after time in the Caribbean areas and Florida and the Gulf Coast in the US. But our strategy is to choose sites that have low risk of flooding and high winds, potentially highly elevated sites using rated enclosures and rooftop load standards and flexible kind of solar racking and anchoring and also storing on-site fuel. But the idea is if there is a large storm, those who are impacted in high risk areas can go to nearby facilities and be served, whether it's an emergency shelter or it's a public institution that's opening its doors. But that is where, ideally where you want to site microgrids. You don't want to site them in the areas that are going to be hit hardest. You want to site them nearby, but that aren't in those high risk areas. It's a very similar strategy with wildfire. A great example is in California, but really all over the West and the US and across the world. We've seen issues in Australia as well. Again, the idea is there are areas that are impacted by high wildfires. These are not necessarily where you want to build up more infrastructure. However, you want to look at these communities and you want to look at nearby populations and where you can site things like emergency shelters and critical infrastructure microgrids, so that folks that are in these tier 3 high threat areas can go nearby and have access to the public good critical services that everyone should be able to access in times like these. So here's our approach, and I hope that you all can take this and apply it to whatever situation that you're currently working on. But it really starts with identifying critical sites. Everyone might have a different definition of what's critical. And I think that's a really important thing to ask up front. What are you looking to have served in a time of need? What is most important? Hospitals, correctional facilities, water treatment facilities. These are all examples, but that's a good first place to start. And a couple considerations here on the right-hand side that you can see to get that conversation started. So really, this is a conversation starter with stakeholders, ultimately to develop a plan. The next step after finding critical infrastructure is finding the high-risk areas. This could be to whatever vulnerabilities that your area, service territory, jurisdiction, region is experiencing. That may be one of the 3 natural disasters we just talked about. It could be a lot of different other things, man-made disasters, other high-risk vulnerabilities to the system. A good idea to do, as much as you have the capabilities to map these things out. GIS is a great resource to understand the low, the moderate, and the high-risk areas to power outages. Working with utilities, or if you are a utility, understanding your reliability constraints could also help lead you to understanding where high potential microgrid systems are. Because sometimes a microgrid can serve the grid 99% of the time when there's no storm, and that could actually provide a benefit to the utility. And then that 1%, when that storm comes and the outage occurs, that microgrid is there to support the community and the customer. So that's a win-win solution. We also have a set of citing criteria that we have used at SEPA, working with state energy offices, the Department of Energy, and utilities across the country. Again, this is very, reliant on where you are and what type of scenario and environment you're in. However, critical sites, natural disaster threats, reliability hotspots are super critical. Understanding energy burden and population density is very important as well. Those who historically have not been served with the same quality and consistency as other places, that's even more important to look at so that these microgrids can be planned equitably. Geographic constraints is important. A great example is in Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico, the Hurricane Maria came through, and a lot of the transmission lines that were running north to south on the island were wiped out. And a lot of these rural communities were then left without power. So understanding where mountainous conditions are in rural communities may point you to understand where a remote microgrid might be a better fit than building long transmission lines or long distribution lines. That's a consideration, and that is a really good, keep that in mind, because when John is presenting next about the project down in the Outer Banks in North Carolina, geographic constraints is critical there, being an island. Environmental justice and equity, I mentioned that as well. So here again are some other key considerations when you all are doing this on your own to consider. I highly recommend doing this as an exercise. It can be very beneficial, and we've run it many times with our clients and members. Lastly is to, of course, get an understanding around the size of these microgrids. So we understand where the critical sites are and what the critical infrastructure is. But in order to size a system appropriately, it's necessary to understand, the energy consumption at that site and the critical loads at that site. For instance, if we're looking at a public high school or an elementary school, that may have yearly annual energy consumption However, there might be some more critical loads, such as ensuring that there's internet access and phone charging and things like air conditioning and space heating. Those are the most critical functions. And understanding those critical loads can help you size a system, whether it be with solar generation, energy storage, other types of local generation. That can tell you how big those systems need to be. And the approach that we've taken is kind of laying out different renewable scenarios. SEPA is an organization that's driving towards carbon free. So we want to look at how renewable energy can be incorporated into microgrids to help that transition. But that all depends on your local conditions, what the solar potential is at that site. In some cases, there may be natural gas infrastructure to leverage to act as a backup fuel and to reduce the cost. Those are just some of the considerations to take during this step in sizing the microgrid. Lastly is ultimately kind of to develop this plan. I lay these steps out in 5 incremental steps, but I don't think these are mutually exclusive of each other. I think some of these can actually happen on their own, depending on where you're at in the process. But the idea is, if you're looking at a whole service territory, a whole region, a whole town or village, this is where you may want to understand where are the site-specific microgrid installations where you may want to deploy those. And if we're talking about a more of a urban environment, there may be some critical sites that are clustered together. So what that means is that there might be a gas station across the street from a police station, across the street from a hospital, which, because of economies of scale, there might be an opportunity to actually cluster and network them together into one regional community microgrid. And there's cost benefits to that, and other engineering design considerations when you're connecting multiple facilities. However, that is a part of the deployment strategy and something that should be considered. When sites are on the same circuit and within a specific radius of each other, there are benefits to clustering them. And lastly, before I get to hand it over to John to talk about some projects in North Carolina and some specific examples of kind of walking through this process and planning in more concrete examples, we do have a design framework that's getting published next month, and this is a little bit of a sneak preview of it. It is a extension or expansion on the planning. So once sites do bubble up through the process I just walked through, the next question really you might be asking is, all right, well, how exactly are we going to design these things? And what does it actually mean? And if you're working with engineers, these are the questions that they're going to ask. Depending on where you are in the world, some of these questions may or may not be relevant, specifically around the regulatory implications. But many places around the world, there are regulatory hurdles on developing microgrids and crossing public rights of way and utilizing infrastructure. So there are a lot of important conversations that need to be happen early, and involving the utility, if it's not utility led, is critical. And if it is utility led, then those are the questions that you need to be asking. What's the regulatory structure here of this project? Steps 2 through 10 really walk you through the half dozen questions to ask to get from a conceptual design ultimately through an engineering design. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to John. John's going to go into more of these in detail and give you a more specific view on some of the projects. I'm happy to take questions after the presentation, so I know that some questions are coming in. But with that, John, I'm gonna stop sharing my screen so you can.
All right, thanks, Jared.
Let's see.
All right. Thank you, Jared, for that. And I think your presentation leads very well into the discussion that I want to have with the group on our microgrid pilots and programs and the lessons learned with the North Carolina Electric Cooperatives. Appreciate the opportunity to talk to this group. And as Jake mentioned, I have been with the electric co-ops for approximately 8 years, in the utility space for about 17, working in operations, system planning, and then now leading a team that's focused on distributed energy resource construction and deployment, and bringing that into our portfolio and aggregating those resources and extracting the reliability use cases with our upstream utilities. So what I would like to talk to the group today, first, I want to introduce you to the North Carolina Electric Cooperatives and who we are. Talk to you about the microgrids and how we started with our pilots and our 2 projects at Ocracoke and Butler Farms, and how we've evolved that into a program that is available for our members to market with their end-use consumers. And then in those programs, talk about the opportunities that we've had with developers, commercial and industrial customers to deploy microgrids throughout the cooperative territory. So here in the state of North Carolina, NCEMC, who I'm with, is the wholesale power provider to 26 distribution cooperatives across the state. Now, if you're not familiar with North Carolina, we have the pleasure, geography-wise, of having the mountains in the western part of the state to the coastal area in the eastern part of the state. Our tagline that we like to use is that we are driven by service and inspired by innovation. These 26 distribution cooperatives are not-for-profit, member owned, and governed by a board of directors that are elected by those member consumers. Our service is to provide electricity, but the purpose of the electric cooperatives is to support and empower our members and communities through economic development, community outreach, and delivering new energy solutions to improve the quality of life of cooperative members. In these parts of the state, we are typically rural. Some of the cooperatives are just on the outskirts of some of the cities, but the electric cooperatives, if you're not familiar, were started to bring electricity out over 70 years ago to the areas of the United States that were not traditionally served by the utilities at the time. And so we are one of the largest generation and transmission cooperatives in the country in support of these electric cooperatives. So I want to start with my end. If you take nothing else from my presentation, I want to leave you with this lesson, and that microgrids, as Jared spoke about, are one tool in the toolbox that you can use to solve the solution that you're looking for. But what I want to tell you is that success comes when you focus on communications, defining and implementing your use cases, and then your ongoing support after commissioning these projects. One thing that we've learned in deploying our microgrids as we look to standardize is that microgrids are not what you call cookie cutter, and each site is unique. And so from the design to the construction, to the commissioning, and to the implementation, there's opportunities to apply lessons learned and to move forward in your learning. The requirements for success that we see is that it takes the collaboration of the local engineering and operations staff at our member distribution cooperatives. So they know their system. It is constructed to deliver that power from those centralized substations to their end use consumers. And because these microgrids are distributed energy assets on their distribution systems, it really takes their collaboration early and through the life cycle of the project. Because there's multiple stakeholders involved, success comes from clearly defining and documenting operational agreements and procedures. And what I mean by that is you have assets that are going to be owned by different parties, and I'll speak to that. So who can operate it? who maintains it when it breaks, and having those procedures documented so that they go beyond the project life cycle and beyond staff, so that if they move on or decide to work elsewhere, that those procedures can be referenced when you have questions or need to move forward. And then this last one may seem intuitive if you are a utility engineer, but distribution systems are not perfectly balanced at all levels, meaning that the power flow is not balanced. And so you have to make sure that the system can handle those imbalances, not being perfect, and move forward. The pilot to concepts back in 2015, our CEO, very forward thinking, was reading about microgrids and hearing about the technology, and brought together an innovation team to map out project concepts. We ended up with 2 microgrids, which were our Butler Farms and our Ocracoke microgrid, but he really wanted us to look at innovative distributed resources that could showcase new technology. This project team represented people from all across the company, from accounting to engineering to rates design to legal. And I really think that helped us springboard our projects. It was taken to our board of directors and received full approval. It was funded out of our research and development budget. And I saw one of the questions that was in the chat. And what we looked at was that the entity that invested in the asset or the resource received the benefit. And we felt that was important because that preserves the regulatory structure of the electric service that was provided to the end use consumers. Now, in these microgrids, we'll talk about, there can be assets that are owned by NCEMC as the wholesale power provider. There can be assets that are owned by the distribution cooperative. And there are assets that we're even using in our microgrids that are owned by the member consumers. And so that structure of the whoever invests receives the benefit was important, and we'll talk through with the projects. As far as microgrids in North Carolina for the cooperatives, we have 4 operational projects. The Ocracoke Island microgrid was our first, that came online in 2017. The Butler Farms project, which I helped do the project management for, was in 2018. And more recently, our Heron's Nest and our Eagle Chase microgrids, which are built around community subdivisions and living, came online in 2020 and 2021. We do have a 5th microgrid in development at Roseacre Farms that we expect to be online at the end of the year. And all along the way, these microgrids were made possible through strategic partnerships and really partnering with vendors, research entities at our national level, some of the national labs, to leverage expertise, because the Ocracoke Island microgrid was the first microgrid in the state of North Carolina. And it was also, microgrids were not really being developed at the pace that they are now. And so we wanted to develop the expertise in-house, but we needed external partners to help us do these projects. Jared mentioned in his discussion, I'll say that power systems are very reliable. And so you build a microgrid and you design your use cases. And one of those needs to be looking at demand response, because when you are planning for a gray sky day, how do you leverage the asset when you are connected to the grid and operating normally? Of course, there are resilience and sustainability objectives within our microgrids that we'll talk about. So the Ocracoke microgrid, and it's fitting that we're here talking about microgrids and we're talking about resiliency, because approximately 4 years ago, there was a cable cut that caused a almost week-long outage to the Outer Banks. And it was done just as we were bringing the Ocracoke microgrid online. For those of you who may not be familiar, the Ocracoke Island is part of our coastal Outer Bank region. You can see the landmass out sort of in the middle of the water. It's a very small year-round population and a small area. Now, the Outer Banks, much like the coast of North Carolina or really any coastal region, the population swells in the summertime as the tourist season comes along. There's a long exposed distribution feeder that serves the area. From the mainland, it's approximately 75 miles of a radial power feed that goes through 4 voltage conversions, underground cabling, submarine cabling in this instance. And the marine environment is very harsh with high winds and storms, and the generation capacity is well below the peak loads that we see during the summer tourist season. So for our microgrid at Ocracoke, we have all utility-owned assets for generation. We do have consumer-owned demand response components in smart thermostats and water heater controls. But we took our existing diesel generation site, approximately 3 megawatt diesel generation site, and we added solar to the roof, as you can see in the picture, that had to be designed for hurricane force winds. And also one thing in this area is you can't, ground mounted solar would be susceptible to flooding, but also high land prices just due to the area that it's in. And we added a Tesla battery, 500 kilowatt, 1 megawatt hour Tesla battery to supplement the generation for Ocracoke Island. Interesting, when we started talking through the project, it was the system engineer at Tideland EMC who serves Ocracoke. And we were talking through needs of the cooperative, and they said, it sure would be nice to have another diesel out at Ocracoke to help us serve the community when there's a power outage. And we sat down and really started thinking and said, another diesel is probably not going to happen, but what can we do instead? And so the Ocracoke microgrid was born, and the assets were designed. So I'm going to go into my first lesson here and talk about effective grounding. You can see sort of as I talked about where we go 115,000 volts through the Outer Banks region and then transition to the submarine cable. And you can see the location of our diesel. We have that installed on the 12 kV system along with the load. Well, initially when we installed the battery component of the microgrid, we put it on the 25 kV side. And we went through our use cases and we said, we want to test islanding and test the ability during non-peak times to serve the island with the microgrid. The diesel is the grid forming entity, meaning that in the outage that the diesel starts first to form the island, and then the battery and the solar are used to supplement that generation. When we tested our use case and we brought the system back online, we were told that the 25 kV system experienced very high voltages, causing lightning arresters to fail, dropping out the voltage and kicking the generator offline. When we attempted to re-sync and perform the test again, we had the assets trip off. So post-event analysis and looking at the event, at first we weren't really sure what happened. Further analysis looked at that when we were running the batteries on the 25 kV system, due to our transformer configuration, we did not have an effective ground reference for the battery system to reference and to regulate the voltage. And so the good thing is that was limited to the 25 kV system. And what we ended up doing for the technical people, it was a delta to Y transformer. And so that delta high side didn't provide us the effective ground. We relocated the battery down onto the 12 kV side, closer to the load, or the same voltage of the load, same voltage as the generator, and have since tested the island, and we were successful. Our findings came out about the same time that EPRI and their program came out on effective grounding with inverter-based generation. And what was validating was that what NCEMC experienced was one of the lessons that EPRI came out in their standardized grounding transformer connections and in the report. So not only did it validate our use case and our issues, but we have that NCEMC standardized our transformer configuration for future microgrids so that we can address the effective grounding and not have these issues again. So the second lesson at our Ocracoke microgrid that I want to talk about is to know your environment. You can see pictures here of flooding. Back in 2019, Hurricane Dorian came through and we had record flooding on Ocracoke Island. When we designed the project, and you see the photo of the batteries, those batteries are up on a 4-foot tall concrete platform. And you can see how close the water is to those batteries. The flooding that we experienced during this event reached up almost to 6 feet. And so the flooding caused power outages and caused an outage at the Ocracoke Island. The system went down, and I can tell you that once we got personnel on site, the lower left-hand corner, you can see the water is at the door of the diesel generation site. And so we did have some prolonged outages where we had to get personnel on site to inspect the diesel, inspect the batteries, inspect the solar. But we were able to use the microgrid to restore power to the island a day earlier than the power from the mainland coming in was brought back to restore power. So definitely need to take environmental attributes into mind when you are planning your systems. The third one is to be flexible and adapt. A couple years after Ocracoke microgrid came online and in response to running the system in an island for maintenance or during an outage, our engineering team came and said it would be really nice to have a way that you could dynamically use the battery to shape and operate. So what we were doing is we were bringing the diesel online. We would then bring the battery online and base load the output, use the diesel to regulate, and then adjust if we were doing a long run, charge back the battery. They said it'd be real nice to be able to set parameters based on the load to bring the diesel on and to levelize the output and then use the battery to dynamically follow the load. So we brought together our operations team, our engineering team, and did a control system modification where we're able to use the battery to dynamically load follow. And we call it the single island or the 2-island mode. So in just support of Ocracoke Island, or feeding back up through the submarine cable to the larger Outer Banks where we've got another set of diesels. And so when you design your use cases and you design your system, you have to be prepared that a new use case is going to come up that you've not previously thought about. And so how can you be flexible and adapt to make that use case possible? At Butler Farms, when we were testing, we built the project out in multiple phases. And so during our phase 2 testing, which is supporting the farm on the microgrid, but also going out on the distribution line and supporting 28 homes within our isolation boundary, we had some issues that came up. And so my fourth lesson is around your reference voltage that you're using for your island operation. You can see here in these boxes the trend of our power output of the microgrid, where we had trips and we had the system drop off. And the microgrid operates on 400 volts on the secondary side, but that voltage was hard-coded into our control system. And so when we were operating in our emergency voltage band, it just so happens that this test was done during a really, really hot period of time, real high loads. And so the control system was set to take that absolute 400 volts and then do our plus or minus 10%. But again, in utility practical operations, during high loads, your system may run off of that nominal voltage and may run low. And so we were having trips on the microgrid, and we couldn't figure out why. The team identified this hard-coded value, and they went into being right before the island. They would take a snapshot of the voltage, and they would use that as their reference. When the control system modifications were made, as you can see towards the second half of our test, the microgrid ran and dynamically adjusted for the loads, and then it shut down and went back into grid forming when we told it to. So be careful of where you're measuring your reference and that the system is set properly. My fifth lesson that I want to share with you is when you are dealing with customers and building microgrids, when it comes time to do commissioning, don't simulate an outage for the convenience of the customer. Work with the customer and put the microgrid through its paces, just as if it were a real grid outage. So what happened is, shortly after bringing on Butler Farms, we had a hurricane that came through, Hurricane Florence, and you can see on the map we had a tree fall on the distribution line. And so the R's represent the reclosers or the boundaries, where R3 down is where we support the farm, and then between R2 and R4 is where we can support the feeder. So a tree fell within the feeder boundary, which means that the microgrid should have come up and supported the farm until the tree was taken off of the line. That's not what happened. We had, you can see from our event times, we had the feeder go out. The microgrid did not transition, and then due to the UPS on the controller, on the centralized controller, the battery being drained, the system shut down. And so by the time they could get out and clear the tree off the line, it was a couple days later. And so again, doing our root cause and saying what happened. When we simulated the testing during the commissioning and loss of phase and operation, what we didn't realize was that in this specific type of recloser, we were using an alarm feature to indicate an issue as one of the triggers for the microgrid. Well, because it was simulated, we didn't realize that one of the events that could generate this alarm, which would say, we've got a recloser issue, we cannot transition the microgrid, is a loss of AC alarm. And so loss of AC power, grid power, is inherent to a microgrid needing to operate. And so once we realized the flaw in our design that was not found because we didn't create actual outages and reprogram the system, we a year later had another tree fall down, and we were able to, here we go, a year later we had another tree that fell down on the feeder. Again, it created so we could not serve the community on the distribution feeder, but the microgrid successfully recognized the outage, and we transitioned into what we call farm island mode, so supporting the farm for the 20-minute duration. And so again, the key here is when you design your microgrid to support a community, you need to do your real world testing and not your simulations, because you could have something that's lying dormant until you need the system to operate. So use cases and values. Here we see from the wholesale power side, using these resources in a demand response helps us save on our power supply costs, which are then passed on to our members. You can use them for ancillary services, having localized generation. You can use for voltage support. You can also use these in your use case to provide power quality and stability. The resiliency and reliability is, I think, inherent in our microgrid design. So the ability to island and support the community with localized generation assets. And then there are use cases where you can use components that are within a microgrid for asset deferral. So delaying transformer upgrades or reconductoring and even new lines or substations. So I'm going to come back to the contractual arrangements and agreements for Butler Farms that we talked about. So at Butler Farms, we have utility-owned generation in the battery and the control system. And then we are using generation that's owned by the farm. So solar, biogas, and even a diesel that's used for traditional standby power. Because the farmer owns the biogas generator, when they are generating electricity, whether they are grid connected or in the island scenario, there is a meter on that generator that registers the production, and the farmer is compensated for that electricity. From the battery side, NCEMC owns that. And so when that battery is discharged for the larger portfolio value, the output of that battery is added on to the power supply bill that we provide to the local distribution cooperative. Now, in an island scenario, when the battery is providing electricity, whether it be to the farm or to the larger community, the electricity out of that battery is again charged back to the distribution cooperative. But then the in-use consumer's meter is registering that energy consumption at whether or not they're connected to the grid. South River, because those are their utility customers, bill them for the electricity that would otherwise not be billed without the microgrid. So again, by preserving the regulatory structure and how we've designed our microgrids, we feel that this enables us to build out our use cases and to build out our projects and use assets that can be owned by the utility, by the end use consumer, or by us as the wholesale power provider. So Jake, I'm going to stop there. In the slide deck, I want to let the group know that we do have slides on our different microgrids, and that includes our resilient neighborhood at Eagle Chase and our microgrid that was done at a sustainable neighborhood community in North Carolina. And so I want to be respectful of the time, but if people have questions on those, then we can go into the slide deck. But if not, when you're given this deck and you look through those, our website, ncelectriccooperatives.com, has more information on our microgrids, or they can reach out to me and we can talk further.
Great. Thank you so much, John. And I know Jared had some resources in his presentation as well. So those will definitely be sent out to all of our attendees after the webinar. We do have a couple of questions from the audience so far. The first one is, what's the biggest difference between setting up microgrids around public and emergency facilities as opposed to just installing backup power and fuel supply? And there's also kind of a related question on that as to who's kind of responsible for the cost investment.
Yeah, maybe I'll start with that. And I think that when you install a microgrid that has a backup generator and a fuel supply, a lot of times that is for a smaller subset. You know, when I talk about Butler Farms, our microgrid and the assets not only support the farm where they're installed, but then we're able to use the electrical infrastructure and serve in a 28 home area. Eagle Chase, the resilient neighborhood I talk about, when the neighborhood builder, he was originally going to put standby generators at each home in this 31 home community. And so a propane generator, local fuel source, and a generator for the home is good. But if one consumer in this neighborhood loses their generator or it's out, then that consumer doesn't have electricity while the rest of their neighborhood does. And so through conversations with the builder, the electric distribution cooperative, and NCEMC, we put a microgrid in the neighborhood. It's a 300 kilowatt propane generator and a battery. And so that microgrid can serve the entire community, not just that localized standby generator. And what they also were able to do to answer the question that was asked, Wake Electric, who's the cooperative, owns that propane generator. And so through the structure with the neighborhood, they do fuel procurement and maintenance on the generator that's paid for by the homeowners association of the neighborhood. So it allows the resiliency of the community without that individual consumer to have to worry about the maintenance and the fuel supply that goes along with an individualized asset.
Right. Thank you. Jared, any additional comments on that?
No, I think John hit it all.
Okay.
I mean, there's a lot of the considerations based on the customer's preferences. So, we've worked with a lot of different customers that aren't necessarily thrilled about the optics of having a diesel, standby backup generator, and they'd like to explore more of an advanced type of technology.
Mm-hmm. We have another question. Are there any microgrids currently based on a hydrogen system? Or Jared, do you know?
Not that I've worked on, but I certainly know that there's a lot of applications going on actually in California. A company called Bloom Energy looking at green hydrogen fuel cell generation for microgrid projects. So not off the top of my head, but that's one company that's doing it. So I know it's out there and it's definitely getting momentum.
Gotcha. Still in exploration, I see. Okay. Can you talk a little bit about the cost effectiveness of these microgrids and kind of the financial aspect of it, and can standardization of these kinds of projects bring the cost down?
Sure. I think it's important, again, going back to your use case and looking at your value, because when microgrids are installed on a system that has high reliability, there is not a lot of opportunity for them to operate. And so you have to look at those demand response components to see how you are going to get a return on your investment. So energy arbitrage, demand savings, things like that can help make projects cost effective. Standardization is something that we at the North Carolina Electric Cooperatives are looking at, and that goes from controller design to the balance of plant engineering. Again, each microgrid that we've done is unique, but where we can standardize controller vendors, if we're bringing in, say, energy storage, are we using the same vendor that we've worked with? So it is important, but typically we've not seen a lot of area for standardization other than maybe how we want the controller to act. If you do this, it responds this way. And so by standardizing that, yes, we've been able to work on costs. But I think flexibility and uniqueness of projects is something that we're working through as well. We also see a lot of value in, when Jared talked about in his graphic of a microgrid, and each one of our projects has a centralized microgrid controller, right? The brains of the system that has knowledge of the assets and based on system conditions tells them how to act. We have a lot of interest in going away from a centralized controller more to a distributed controller. So can you have, especially across microgrids that are not in a small footprint, do you have distributed controllers that help you deal with a N-1 or a loss of your main controller? And so that's a space that we are hoping that we will see development in the years to come, that maybe that helps bring down costs away from a centralized controller. Because knowledge of assets requires reliable communications. And so in a lot of ours, where we're communicating to remote assets, we're using fiber optic. And that's, that can increase your costs significantly as well.
I'll just add microgrid controller standardization is critical. I think one microgrid is one microgrid, but if you have a process to plan and design a microgrid, then the end result might look different, but at least you have a standardized process template framework. Microgrid controller is definitely something that can be standardized. So working with different vendors. SEPA worked with Southern Company down in the Southeast and NREL and DOE on publishing a something that Southern Company put together on, a specifications document for microgrid controller vendors. So if you're going out and soliciting bids on microgrid controllers, that's a good template document to look at. John, I'm not sure if you've seen that, but I'm going to post it in the chat for everyone to see.
Okay, great. And I can include that in the email. That'll get sent out to everyone after the webinar. We have one more question from the audience. I can't necessarily decipher it, but it says, when the main grid reaches a microgrid, what policy experience can you share to allow the operator to remain in business?
I'll start with that. And then John, I'm curious what you think. From experience with regulated utilities in the US, when a microgrid is interconnected into the grid, there are a lot of things that need to happen between the utility and that microgrid operator or customer, that third party. And a lot of those are being kind of fleshed out right now in California and Hawaii around microgrid tariffs, which include interconnection agreements and other special operating agreements between the microgrid operator and the utility. So that might mean, investments on the distribution system that the microgrid operator has to pay for interconnecting their system. That's one example. Standby tariffs is another. Just to pay for that connection point, costs money when they do rely on the grid is another example. And then lastly, I'll say that the microgrid operating kind of scheme is extremely important. So who's controlling what when the grid does go down, and to ensure that electricity is not getting pushed onto the grid in an unsafe manner. So I think safety and reliability are included in those agreements so that the utility company, the utility provider isn't let's call it like, isn't disadvantaged from a affordability standpoint or safety or reliability standpoint, and ensures that they can help interconnect these systems and work collectively, but also ensure that they're still, their business is sustainable and their power is reliable.
Yeah, I agree with Jared, and that gets back to my comment. Because the microgrids in North Carolina are partnerships between NCEMC and our distribution cooperatives, but we're separate entities, and so the interconnection agreements. But as Jared said, safety is number one. And so when we sit down and we talk about the operating agreements that I mentioned and documenting those use cases, that includes, when does the utility have the right to lock the site out from not operating for the safety of their personnel working upstream? Because we believe in shared operational capabilities between us as the wholesale power provider and our distribution cooperatives as the grid operators, our operating agreements include the shared capability for them to be able to click the button to go from grid connected to island mode. And so working out those rules and procedures around who has control of what asset is paramount. And when you get outside of the, when it's a third party in a utility, those agreements traditionally that would go through an interconnection process may need to be expanded because of the different use cases for the microgrid.
Got it. Well, thank you both for for helping answer those questions and for your great presentations. And Sheila, do you have anything else that you wanted to add?
No, it's just an honor to have you join us, both of you, and look forward to hearing more about the developments. I know there's many more creative ideas out there that are going to help us reduce CO2, reduce infrastructure costs, and basically move us forward. So it's very exciting, and the co-ops should lead the way. They provide 20% plus of the electric power in the United States, and have done a great job with it since nearly, I would guess, nearly 100 years ago when they started kicking it off. So I think it's, and I think actually it was Lyndon Johnson's mother that started it all. She had to carry water up a hill and down a hill, and they had no power. And I think it was old LBJ that got it really started. So thank you so much, and great history and great future ahead.
Great. And thanks to all of our attendees for joining us for this webinar. Again, we'll be posting a recording of the webinar on the website, and we will send you the PowerPoint presentations as well. Thank you all for joining, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of the week.